June 19, 1953, Sing Sing Prison, New York. A husband and a wife are strapped into the electric chair. The witness whose testimony sent them to this room was not a foreign agent or a professional spy, but the woman's own flesh and blood, her brother. This remains the only time in the history of the United States that civilians were executed for espionage during peacetime. As the switch was thrown, two young children waited at home for a phone call that would never come. This is the dark descent into the Rosenberg case, a moment where family ties were severed by political fever and secrets were traded in the dead of night.
Attention.
In the early
This is a civil
1950s,
defense
the
warrant.
world felt like a
Seek
powder
shelter
keg with a
immediately.
short fuse. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb years ahead of Western predictions, sending a shockwave through the corridors of Washington. The question haunting every intelligence agency wasn't just how the Soviets did it, but who helped them. The trail of evidence led away from the high-security labs of Los Alamos and into the modest, cramped apartments of New York City. Here lived Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a seemingly ordinary couple, a radio technician and a housewife. Yet within months, their names would become synonymous with the ultimate betrayal. The investigation began with a whisper across the Atlantic. Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had worked on the top-secret Manhattan Project, confessed to passing nuclear data to Soviet handlers. His confession triggered a domino effect of arrests. He pointed to a courier named Harry Gold, who in turn pointed to a humble army sergeant named David Greenglass. David was stationed at the very heart of the American nuclear program in New Mexico. But more importantly, he was Ethel Rosenberg's younger brother. When the FBI knocked on David's door, the pressure of a potential death sentence caused the family's foundation to crack wide open. David Greenglass claimed he had been recruited into a spy ring by his brother-in-law, Julius. He described a clandestine world of sketches, technical descriptions, and late-night meetings. But it was his testimony regarding his own sister, Ethel, that would become the most chilling and controversial element of the case.
Just sign the confession,
Initially,
David, it's
David
over.
told investigators that his sister had
won't do
nothing
it.
to do with the operation.
You think-
However, as the trial loomed and the government sought more leverage, the story shifted. He began to describe a scene in a New York apartment where Ethel sat behind a typewriter, meticulously documenting stolen secrets. This image of the typist of doom would eventually lead her to the chair, despite later
understand the
evidence
charges
suggesting
against
her
me,
role
but I
may have
assure
been
you,
a
my actions
fabrication
were
designed
justified under the
to protect
circumstances we
others.
faced.
The trial was a spectacle fueled by the era's profound vulnerability. The prosecution painted a picture of a vast underground network dedicated to the total destruction of the American way of life. The centerpiece of their evidence was a torn Jell-O box, a crude but effective method of identification where two halves would be matched by agents in the field to confirm their identities. To a jury living under the shadow of a potential mushroom cloud, this was the smoking gun. Throughout the proceedings, Julius and Ethel remained stoic, refusing to name names or admit to the charges. Their silence was interpreted by the public not as a claim of innocence, but as a sign of unshakable ideological commitment to a foreign power. The atmosphere in America during the trial was one of intense paranoia. The Red Scare was at its peak, and the Rosenbergs became the focal point for all collective national anxiety. Outside the courtroom, however, the world was deeply divided. Protests erupted in Paris, London, and Rome. Figures like Albert Einstein and Jean-Paul Sartre pleaded for clemency, arguing that the evidence, particularly against Ethel, was dangerously thin and based almost entirely on oral testimony from a man trying to save his own life. They suggested that the punishment did not fit the crime, but their pleas fell on deaf ears in a nation that felt it was fighting for its very survival. As the execution date drew near, the couple was held at Sing Sing, separated by bars but united in their resolve. Their letters to one another, which have since become haunting historical artifacts, speak of a bond that transcended their grim reality. They wrote of their political convictions and their deep love for their young sons, Michael and Robert. They tried to explain a world they were about to leave, attempting to reconcile their roles as parents with the roles they had chosen in a global conflict. These letters remain a window into a domestic life interrupted by the highest stakes of geopolitics. The final hours on June 19, 1953, were a frantic blur of legal appeals. The Supreme Court was petitioned multiple times, and the decision eventually landed on the desk of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He declined to intervene, stating that the betrayal of a nation's most sensitive secrets was a crime of unparalleled gravity. As the sun set, all legal avenues were exhausted. Julius Rosenberg went first. He walked calmly to the chair, and the process was over in moments. But for Ethel, the end was far more visceral. Reports from witnesses at the time suggest that her heart continued to beat after the initial surges of electricity, requiring several more applications of the current. It was a jarring, heavy conclusion to a case that had already pushed the limits of the legal system. Decades later, the release of the Venona intercepts, decrypted Soviet cables from the 1940s, provided a new perspective on the mystery. These documents confirm that Julius was indeed a productive asset for the Soviet Union, known by the code name Liberal.
Here are the
He had
documents.
managed a ring of informants and passed along
rendezvous is
significant
here.
technical data.
Make sure.
However, the cables were notably silent regarding Ethel's direct involvement in espionage. While they suggested she was aware of her husband's activities, there was little to support the prosecution's claim that she was a primary operative or the mastermind behind the typewriter. The revelation transformed the story from one of simple guilt into a complex tragedy of prosecutorial overreach. The legacy of the Rosenbergs continues to haunt the American consciousness because it occupies a liminal space where justice and fear collide. Their story raises questions that remain uncomfortably relevant today. How much of an individual's life can be sacrificed for the perceived safety of the collective? Where does the loyalty to one's family end and the duty to one's country begin? The children of the Rosenbergs, who were later adopted and took the name Mirapol, have spent much of their lives seeking to clear their mother's name. They do not argue that their father was entirely innocent of all charges, but they point to the vast discrepancy between the evidence presented and the ultimate price paid. As we look back at the grainy photographs of the couple, Julius with his thin mustache and Ethel with her stern, composed gaze, we are looking at a mirror of a different time. It was an era when a sketch of a lens mold or a description of a firing mechanism could theoretically shift the balance of world power. The atomic spies were caught in a storm they helped create, but the ferocity of that storm was fueled by a world that had forgotten the concept of mercy. The echoes of the electric chair at Sing Sing still vibrate through history, a somber note in the symphony of the Cold War. Some believe the Rosenbergs were the necessary scapegoats for a government that needed to explain why it had lost its nuclear monopoly so quickly. Others maintain they were willing participants in a game of high-stakes espionage that put millions of lives at risk. The truth likely lies in the messy, gray areas of human conviction. They were true believers in an era that demanded absolute allegiances, and they paid for those beliefs with the only currency that truly matters. The story doesn't end with the closing of the FBI file. It continues every time a new document is declassified or a witness offers a final confession. David Greenglass, late in his life, finally admitted that he had lied about the typewriter incident. He confessed that he had been pressured by prosecutors to implicate his sister to ensure his own wife, Ruth, would not be charged. He chose his wife over his sister, a decision that resulted in a permanent scar on the family tree. He admitted he didn't even remember if Ethel had actually typed the notes, but he supposed she had at the time. This final admission adds a bitter layer of betrayal to an already dark saga, confirming that the typist of doom narrative was built on a foundation of coerced testimony. In the end, the Rosenbergs remain a historical paradox. They were a simple couple from the Lower East Side who found themselves at the center of a global hurricane. Their fate was determined by a combination of genuine espionage, family betrayal, and a national climate of extreme paranoia. Whether they were the most hated spies in America or the most tragic casualties of the Cold War depends entirely on which lens you use to view the past. The shadows they left behind are long, stretching from the desert of New Mexico to the silent halls of the Supreme Court. The silence that followed their execution was not one of peace, but of a lingering, unresolved tension. The secrets they took to their graves were eventually whispered by others, and the world moved forward into the era of mutually assured destruction. Yet the image of the husband and wife facing the end together remains a haunting symbol of a decade defined by fear. It is a story that refuses to be buried, a dark thriller from reality that continues to challenge our understanding of loyalty and justice. As the files age and the witnesses pass away, the Rosenbergs fade into the realm of historical enigma. We are left with the transcripts, the letters, and the realization that in the theater of global politics, the smallest players often bear the heaviest burdens. Their names are etched into the stone of the 20th century, a permanent reminder of a time when a family was torn apart by the very secrets they swore to protect. The mystery remains, the debate continues, and the ghost of the Jell-O box still lingers in the corners of the collective mind, a testament to the enduring power of a secret shared in the dark. Today, when we speak of national security and the lengths a state will go to protect itself, the names Julius and Ethel Rosenberg act as a cautionary boundary. Their case reminds us that when fear rules the day, the truth is often the first casualty, followed closely by the bonds of family. The atomic spies were more than just figures in a newsreel. They were the focal point of a world learning how to live with the threat of total annihilation. Their story is a descent into the depths of human loyalty, where the cost of a mistake was everything, and the price of silence was an eternity in the shadows.